doctrine of the two kingdoms. So let's go ahead and open with prayer, and then we'll get started. Lord, as always, we are amazed at your knowledge, your wisdom, your plan, the way you guide our steps that bring us together to worship and praise you, and to take this hour to study your word and to talk about the things that we believe and why we believe them. As always, we ask that you inspire our hearts and inform our minds. Let us encourage one another. And as we embark on this season of the capital campaign, help us to have a spirit and a mind set on generosity and on equipping one another through the resources that you've made available to us and that you've given us to manage. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. So last week we talked about the doctrine of the two kingdoms. So it's quiz time. Time for a pop quiz. I know everybody loves those. But this will either be really easy or really hard. It just depends on whether you were here and paid attention last week or not. What's the kingdom of the left? We talk about the kingdom of the left and the kingdom of the right. So who remembers what the kingdom of the left is? And by the way, the long and short answers are on the paper in front of you, so you can cheat.
In the world? The laws of the world?
The laws of the world. Okay, that's one good way of looking at it. Anybody want to add to that or supplement it?
Administration of social order.
Social order is part of the kingdom of the left. You bet. What else? Yeah, we can talk about what things do we encompass in each of the two kingdoms. So social order, the rules and laws of the world. We might say the justice system, and I'm not talking about spiritual justice like justification, but I'm talking about like criminal justice, civil justice, we might say the civil realm. It is so that has nothing to do with God, right?
No.
That was a trick question.
Everything.
It was everything I asked is a trick question. Have you not figured me out yet? No, that's okay. No, in fact, if you look at, oh man, now I'm gonna have to remember page numbers and stuff. You can tell me, it's on like page 2, I think, about the kingdom of the left. And one of the things that we mentioned here, we say under the what is it paragraph, the secular realm, but notice where God's rule is exercised. So this is not happening apart from God, or it's not something where we can just say, well, God has nothing to do with this. No, this is where God's rule is exercised, but it's exercised through what we call natural laws, probably familiar with that term, governance, societal structures, right? So enforcement of laws, administration of civil and criminal justice, maintenance of social order, worldly matters is one way you might put it, things like that. In other words, things that are largely external to the church, kind of outside of what our core mission is, but are important things in our lives, right? These are all very important things for us to be able to live at peace to the extent that we can in society, and to have structures around how we interact with one another and how we interact with the you might say the world on that level. Okay, so that's the kingdom of the left, kind of the secular realm is a way of thinking about it, but it's not divorced from all things pertaining to God, not at all. And we're going to read some Bible verses today that will instruct us about that. How about the kingdom of the right? What is the kingdom of the right?
Spiritual realm.
Okay, the spiritual realm. So it includes what kinds of things? We have civil justice and criminal law and all those things in the kingdom of the left. What kinds of things are in the kingdom of the right?
Sacraments.
The gospel, the sacraments, God's plan of salvation. We might think of it as things that are internal to the church, or things that we consider part of our core mission. This is the helping one another live life with Jesus every day. I think I might have heard about that in the sermon this morning. Right? Maybe. I think we hear about that in the sermon all the time, even if we don't use those words, right? That's usually part of our focus, just as his church, as Jesus's church, right? And so, I won't go through everything that we had on here in the background section. You can read that on your own if you didn't have a chance to. But we talk about what it is and why God instituted it, and the areas in which it works. But it largely comes down to that division between secular and spiritual matters. And just a reminder, Luther concocted this in part because he was acutely aware of the tension that can exist between these things. The whole reason that we got into this lesson was because of tensions in our society today that seem to be largely centered around the upcoming election, not exclusively, but that certainly is pouring fuel onto fires that have already been stoked, as it kind of draws a focus to the kingdom of the left, right? That seems to be, if you ask somebody, like I might ask somebody like, oh, maybe Glenn. Hi, Glenn, how you doing? Yeah, if I were to ask Glenn, what do you think about the world today? I would expect that Glenn's going to give me that answer probably from a perspective of the kingdom of the left, right? And these days, when you hear those kinds of questions asked, a lot of times the response is, oh, things are terrible, it's falling apart, or, you'll hear all kinds of cliches and platitudes about how awful things are, but it's usually not referring to the power of the gospel, right? Referring to the secular realm and how things that are largely outside of the church seem to be all hellbound, right? And or whatever wording you want to use there. And I would say that's an appropriate response, perhaps from that perspective, or at least it can be an honest response, right? If I asked you, how are things going in the kingdom of the right? How might you respond? This is also a trick question, just in case you're wondering something. No, it really isn't. I mean, it's actually kind of an honest question, but it's one that I think we don't normally bring that perspective to that kind of conversation. How are things going in the kingdom of the right? And you can answer that just from how you're feeling about things. You can answer it from a scriptural standpoint. You can answer it in terms of the health of this congregation or the health of Christianity worldwide. So how are things going in the kingdom of the right? Anybody have an opinion or a feeling or something that comes to mind?
I think it'll always be here, always, and God promises that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many people, young adults that have fallen away and aren't coming to church. They might still be spiritual, who knows, because you don't see them
Right.
or talk about it. So I don't know in that respect, but I mean, God will always.
So God is always faithful, but we seem to be in a time when people are wandering away from him. Is that a fair way to characterize your comment?
Although new member class is going on, I just met a young woman, Trish is her name, that's new member here, or new member class.
I love that you brought that up, because I was gonna go to Jeff, and then my next question was gonna be, so the kingdom isn't growing at all, is it? In which we were going to say, but wait, there are some good signs. There are some signs that God really is faithful. And that he's still working on the hearts of men and things like the new member class and people actually coming to Christ, which is happening maybe not so much right around our little piece of the world, but in other areas of the world, there are revivals going on and things, So, again, your perspective is going to probably inform how you answer that. Jeff, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say it is an individual thing as much as it is a sharing thing or spiritual life, because I think that there's more turning back to Christ over the last year and a half than we see, because we're seeing all the negative. But through Christ, you get the peace. If you're in a relationship, and I think a lot of people have lost their peace, and I see that it's where I go and the people I see, there's positivity there, and we're sharing some of these same ideas.
Very good. In fact, there are even some studies that have been published, and you mentioned the past year and a half, something like that, and I've seen it too, that are actually encouraging about young people in particular are now, there seems to be a movement, at least across some swaths of our society, where some of them are now kind of coming back towards the church. These are not huge primary indicators maybe, but there are some indicators there. So even looking at the data, you go, yeah, I think there are some good things happening too. which, may just be a function of how the Holy Spirit works. Because over the course of history, we see lots of movements like that, where there's ebbs and flows, and there are great revivals, and there are periods of what seem to be abject apostasy, and people, wanting to get rid of the church. And even in my adult life, I've seen some of that ebbing and flowing happening, even in American society. I became, I don't know what the right wording, I never know quite how to put this, but when I started caring about the kingdom of the right, which for me was in my teens, especially my late teens, that was a time when, for one thing, I've talked about this, the latest great planet Earth, chariots of the gods, all that stuff, the end time stuff was very big and seemed to be consuming the Protestant part of Christendom. And you go, well, that was really exciting, and people were coming and listening. At the same time, Madalyn Murray O'Hair was at the height of her power and her influence. And we had, okay, so I'm going to use the cliche. We had
Yes,
Madalyn Murray O'Hair, was
atheist.
the arch atheist in American society in the 70s, and led the effort legislatively to remove prayer from schools. That was the, I'm trying to think the name of the organization now, but Madalyn Murray O'Hair was the head of that organization. Basically brought an increased secular influence into the legislative end, specifically in order to get the church removed from secular life, right? And so that was happening, and my point being, that was happening then too. What else happened in the 70s that would be one of the most tremendous evils in the world? And if you know me, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know me that well, then you don't know what I'm talking about. Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, in related cases, which made, the willful killing of innocents legal at any time up to birth, which is just insane. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that was a bad law. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that, but she said it was bad law, not because she didn't believe in abortion. She did. She believed in elective abortion. She thought it should be black letter law. And she said the court cases were too weak and they weren't constructed right. They should have left it with the states. Guess what happened here a couple of years ago? It went back to the states, which is what she had predicted was inevitable. But that, depending on who you believe or who you ask, somewhere between 40 and 60 million dead children can be laid at the feet of that decision. Okay? And I just don't hold back on that. That's evil. That's evil. There's nothing scriptural about it. You can't support it with scripture. You can't support it with common sense. You can't support it with biology. I mean, we still hear, but it's the woman's body. No, it's not. Never has been. What causes a woman to go into labor? Medical people. Somebody knows this. We don't know. But what we suspect is that it's hormones that are stimulated by the baby's body, right? Flowing back through the placenta and so forth. So it's the baby's decision to be born, not the woman's decision. She doesn't decide when she goes into labor. I'm not talking about Pitocin drips and, medically induced stuff, but that's the baby. The baby has a different blood type from the mother in many cases, right? It's a completely genetically complete and unique person. So elective abortion goes against biology. What it doesn't go against is the opinion of a court. Then again, there are a lot of things that the courts have had to correct over the years. I bet a lot of us learned about Dred Scott when you first learned about the Supreme Court. Hopefully you were taught about Dred Scott, in which it was determined that a black person was worth 2/3 of a person. That was U.S. law. The Dred Scott decision. They were not a full person. They did not have full personhood. Had to be rescinded, right? So, we have evils that happen that sometimes cross these lines between things. But point being, if you were to ask me about how the 70s were, I'd say, oh, it was horrible thinking about that. But if I were thinking about the Billy Graham crusades and the people who were interested in finding out about the end time stuff, even though I have theological differences with a lot of those folks now, but the fact that it brought people in you know, and there was so much interest in it. I would say there was kind of a reawakening. You know, there was the, what was the thing with the smiley face? Oh my gosh. It was on billboards. I remember seeing the billboards. The I'm okay, you're okay, pop psychology thing that happened in the seventies. I'm not sure that was good or not. But, you know, so it's really easy to answer out of the kingdom of the left. And not think so much about, is God still growing his church? And does he use the kingdom of the left to do that? And sometimes he does, right? So both of those kingdoms are a way that God exercises control and rule in the world, but they are in different realms, you know? And so in the church, we tend to really focus a lot more on the kingdom of the right, perhaps. And I think that's appropriate because that's our calling under the Great Commission. But the kingdom of the left is where we live day to day. And so, you know, we're kind of the ambassadors for the kingdom of the right in the kingdom of the left. Does that make sense? I think Pastor brought it up in the sermon this morning. He didn't cite it, but it's out of 2 Corinthians 5, for we are ambassadors for Christ, as if Christ himself were entreating through us, be reconciled to God. So I love that he went there. All right, so government though, boy, I just gave this soliloquy on elective abortion and how awful it is. We've had terrible governments. We've had governments that were tolerable, and we've had terrible ones too. And this is just me riffing right now, right? So I don't have to pay attention to the government. I don't need to worry about the government. I can ignore the government and just live in my happy little bubble in the kingdom of the right. Correct? You should agree with me. I'm teaching. Maybe you shouldn't agree with me, John. Let's look at some stuff here. And this is on page 4 of your outline. And I know that because in my leader's guide, I put this is on page 4. I got smart. Instead of being disconnected, I'm just going to start putting page numbers of what you have. So the biblical foundation for government. Oh man, even that heading is now going to make me angry. No, it's not. But let's read Romans 13, 1-7. Can somebody look that up for us and read it nice and loud? Romans 13, verses 1-7. Who's got that? Yeah. I don't know which one of you I pointed at, but you're in line. I've got another one. So Dennis, you can read the next one. How's that?
Every person is to be subject to the governing authority. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Pay to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due. Custom to whom custom. Respect to whom respect. Honor to whom honor.
Okay, thank you. That's aggravating. This is one of those sections where you want to go, maybe Paul wasn't inspired when he wrote this. No, I don't think you can get away with that. In fact, I know you can't. But boy, there's a lot there that applies to me, or words that I have to be reminded of and listen to all the time. This is very kingdom of the left stuff, right? I mean, he talks about, he says to be subject to government, but then he says why. And look at that in verse 4 in particular, for it, and he's talking about government here, is a minister of God to you for good. Even a bad government? Even a bad government? I'll give it to you in just a second, Glenn. There was something else I was going to bring out here, and now I've just completely forgotten it. Oh, Because back in verse 1, those which exist, talking about these ruling authorities, are established by God. So the way this talks about government is not one that makes me happy necessarily, when it's a government that I don't agree with. If it's an administration that I like, then it's a lot easier for me to read this pericope here, this section of verses. Glenn, what were you gonna say?
How do we reconcile that with the story about people having to worship the emperor and they worship God instead?
We're gonna get to that. I'm glad you asked, because that's a great question. And I think we need to look at biblical guidance on that, biblical examples of that, which is exactly what we're gonna do. So great question, and we will get there, I promise. Okay? So I put on the page, it's not always easy to accept or admit that governing authorities are ordained by God. You know, it says established by God in my translation there, to maintain order and justice, because we don't often like how the government does that, and that's true. But Paul's rather strident here. He doesn't give us any outs, does he? Ah, man, I keep looking for the loopholes, just not finding.
But could you not say that we have the free will to vote into those positions of authority? So we do
Absolutely.
get some,
So we are blessed to be in a system where we have, you know,
opportunities.
we have the
to be
opportunity
involved.
to do that. Not everybody does. Right? So in this country, yeah, we certainly can and should. In fact, I'd even suggest that it's a Christian responsibility to seek what is best for everybody. And one of the ways we do that is by exercising our right to vote. So I think that's totally consistent with, again, representing the kingdom of the right in the kingdom of the left. Let's read another section of scripture. I didn't have any other questions outstanding, right? Yeah. So Dennis, would you go ahead and read for us 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17? You can find that 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. So this is Peter's take on the same subject.
Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor or supreme, for it is governments as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should be put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor.
Yeah, so it doesn't say you have to, you don't have to love the emperor here in that sense, but honor that God has put the ruling authorities in place. And out of this section, which, is similar to what Paul says, but Peter inserts something here that I think is really interesting, and that's in verse 16, where he says, be or act as free people, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond servants of God. So this is instructive to me about, this is that influencing the kingdom of the left because we are in the kingdom of the right, and because we have the good news, and because we have all the stuff that God has revealed to us, and we can use that to inform how we interact with people in the kingdom of the left, how we interact with the systems, the authorities, and so forth there. I love that Peter says be free here, because his readers were in a society that was not free. Realize that what he was saying is really pretty remarkable given the context of the first century. How free was Jerusalem? Oh, let's see, occupied by Roman armies, halfway between chaos and utter destruction, which was going to come not too many years later. If you want to say the signs are looking bad, Israel in that time and place was looking really bad. Israel has almost always been in a bad place, right? Between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they were in between battling factions, and through a lot of their history, just Israel was always in a terrible spot, it seems. But including when Peter wrote this, for him to say, act as free people. Like, how can you do that? Well, you can do that because you are of the kingdom of the right. You know that God is ultimately the source of your freedom. And, sometimes he decides to do things that help us attain that freedom, even in the kingdom of the left. And I think about Paul and some of the things that he did and how he appealed to Rome as a citizen. I like to say he used the system, which he absolutely did. But I mean that in the best way. He used the system to further the cause of the gospel. So there's a good example for us of working within a system that itself might be evil, but yet which we can leverage with wisdom in an effort to help bring the gospel to more people, even leveraging those levers that the system might give us. And candidly, not everybody has that chance. Even Paul's a good example of that. Because he was a Roman citizen, he was able to do that. He might not have been able to had he been of a different mother. So, but this is one of the reasons why God picks the people he does, right? All of them are flawed, but God doesn't make mistakes in that regard. So act as free people. I love that. And do not use your freedom as a covering, or you might have a different word there, as a way to get away with evil. It's not an excuse to act evilly yourself, right? And in fact, notice what he says just before that. He says, such is the will of God that by doing right, you silence the ignorance of foolish people. So, and that's a pretty harsh statement there. But what he's saying is a truism, and you've probably experienced this or you've seen it, to where somebody who maintains their integrity, their principles, you might say their God-centeredness in the face of opposition, ends up, I'm going to use the word prevailing, which doesn't always mean they win the argument, but it exposes the darkness that often is the domain of the kingdom of the left. So sometimes you silence it by exposing it for what it is. Sometimes I think God uses us in ways that maybe we don't even anticipate to do things like that. So I don't think we should seek to silence people and make them look foolish. But I think this is what God does, because he's got people from his kingdom, the kingdom of the right, people who know him, have a relationship with him, and bring that influence to the kingdom of the left. And so really it's God proving that his foolishness is wiser than man's wisdom, or, pick your favorite Bible verse about that. Charles, were you gonna say something?
I guess it's safe to assume that governments have been sanctioned by Christ. But at the same time, the right has been not as vocal or as active, which has allowed it to go to.
Yeah, so, so some of that, well, to a very limited extent, in this country, we're able to control what we do, right? And we're blessed to be able to do that. That doesn't mean we're going to get our way, or that God has promised that. Just like he never promised it to Peter, never promised it to Paul, never promised it to anybody, that, I'm going to, well, actually, there are places where he said he was going to take away evil kingdoms and replace them. But ultimately, replacing evil kingdoms with good kingdoms was always pointing forward to Christ, right? One of the examples we're going to read in response to Glenn's question, or not in response to it, but related to that, is about Daniel, which we studied not too many classes ago here. But we had a couple of great examples out of Daniel doing exactly that, and having, all of Daniel's life, he was in an evil system. That never changed. God gave him prophecies about the future, including a kingdom, a godly kingdom that would reign forever, again, pointing forward to Christ. He never said, Daniel, I'm going to rescue you from this. Anybody remember a little background on this? How did Daniel wind up in the situation he was in? Anybody remember his backstory? So Daniel was a good Jewish boy, a smart Jewish boy, and Israel was overrun by the Babylonians. Okay, Babylon ran roughshod over Israel. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but and so one of the ways that they decided to really damage Israel was to take all the bright young men and put them into schooling and into service in the Chaldean system, which was the Babylonian system. And so in Babylon, Daniel and other names you've heard, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were also part of this group, were basically kidnapped from Jerusalem, and they lived the rest of their lives, as far as we know, in Babylon. Even after Babylon fell and Darius came in and took over, they were still there. So they never were delivered out of captivity. They never were. And yet we have some of the greatest stories of faith out of that book and about God's activity in and with it, in amongst his people and with his people and even on behalf of his people. But he kept them in a corrupt, evil, terrible system. Now, we could also say he greatly blessed them there, but he never took them out. So he never promises to take you out of that. He might need us there. You know, this is something that ultimately is for his glory and for the furtherance of his kingdom, and we may not understand it. In the same way, evil dictators and rulers, kings, emperors are sometimes used by God, and they're not aware of it. They have no idea, and they don't have to, because it's not the emperor who's in control of these things. The emperor often thinks he's in control, but he's not. And even that can be a little hard for us to reconcile. It means like, so God wanted Daniel and those other guys to be in a horrible situation for all those decades? Well, in the sense that it's an exercise of his will and his rule in the kingdom of the left, yes. But it was also his plan in the kingdom of the right. And that's where we see that kingdom of the right influencing the kingdom of the left. So let me, okay, so the next section here is actually where we get into this. I'm glad I didn't jump too far ahead on myself here. I started with the story of Joseph as an example of somebody who was in a corrupt, evil, unjust, foreign, in this case, government. And so in the case of Joseph, Genesis 41, we know Joseph's story, right? So we'll just talk about that briefly, right? Joseph was sold into slavery by a bunch of evil marauders, right? Oh, no. By his own brothers because he had done horrible, oh no, because they were jealous. He had a couple of dreams and he was stupid enough to tell them his dreams, right? And those dreams made him look good. But at any rate, you probably know the story pretty well. Joseph got sold into slavery by his own family. That's horrible. That's terrible. Of course, you know, his father was not aware of what had happened, thought he was dead and all that. And then Joseph goes where? Into jail, ultimately, right? He goes into service in Pharaoh's house, gets falsely accused by that dang woman. Not a sexist comment. Maybe it was. No, it wasn't. It was the chick. It's always the chick. No, it's not always the chick, Eve. You know what I'm saying. So falsely accused, thrown into prison, but he also had some kingdom of the right things going on. God had given him a gift of being able to interpret dreams, which he did, and they were ignored pretty much in prison until finally, years later, somebody said, hey, we got this Hebrew slave who's in prison, who's kind of good at this stuff, and nobody else is able to help Pharaoh out with understanding something. And so ultimately what happens? Joseph ends up being a ruler essentially in Egypt, right? And you know the whole story and how he reconciles with his family, and it's a great story. But look at all the awful, terrible things that happened in that. Just terrible things. And if I'm Joseph in those situations, it's like, man, God, what are you doing? All right. Now, I'm really glad we get to read stories like that and learn from them, because I'd like to think now if something like that were to befall me, I'd say, man, God, I'd still say it. I'd say, man, God, what are you doing? But then I'd remember, oh, but you've done this before, haven't you? Okay. So I might not be able to understand it. I might not be able to, you know, left brain analyze it and make perfectly good sense out of it, but I can trust that God is faithful to his promises and that he puts people from the kingdom of the right into horrible situations in the kingdom of the left for his purposes and to accomplish his intent and his will. So Joseph is a great example. Daniel, and not just Daniel, but also those other three guys I mentioned, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By the way, those are their Chaldean names. Those were not their Jewish names, but those were the names that they became known as in Babylon, right? Had a couple of really terrible, like I said, we started off with them being kidnapped from Jerusalem, dragged into service, being put into, schooling and so forth, because they were the best and brightest, and this was part of the strategy there, is we remove the best and brightest from Israel, and Israel will fall. Israel will be left decimated. We won't have to worry about them. Israel will be a shell of its former self because we're taking all the talented young people. We're basically stealing the future of Israel. And we're going to subsume them. We're going to use them. We're going to leverage them for our own selfish purposes. And of course, this was our good friend Nebuchadnezzar, who is a big part of this story. So in Daniel 3, I'm really just tempted. Just as a reminder, let's read a little bit about Daniel 3. So at this point, Daniel has been promoted. There are other things that have already happened. There was a whole thing about dietary laws and all that God got our friends through and helped them with. And Daniel, has this gift of interpreting dreams and understanding visions and things. And so he has risen through the ranks. And they know there's something weird about these guys, because like they wouldn't eat the meat sacrificed to idols, and yet they didn't wither away. They had a horrible diet, and God sustained them through it, and all these other things happened. And so over this period of time, and through the king's dreams and all that, Daniel's status is rising. And so when we get to chapter 3 of Daniel, I'll just read a little bit here. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold. Oh, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar, egomaniac. Okay, he really liked himself. He had a healthy self-concept. He was psychologically in a very safe space because he killed everybody who didn't like him. So I'm not recommending that, by the way, as a strategy for being happy with yourself. Just saying, it's history. So he made an image of gold, 60 cubits by 6 cubits, set it up on the plain of Dura. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent word to assemble the satraps. So these are leaders, kind of like governors. You might say provincial governors and satraps, the prefects and the governors. So my translation uses the word governors, counselors, the treasurers, the judges, in other words, all the VIPs. He called together all the VIPs, the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. And so all of those people did come, and they were assembled for the dedication of the image. In verse 3, they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and then a herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O people, nations, men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe." Yes, they had bagpipes. Yeah, you thought they were just in Scotland. And all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Okay, that's a little extreme, but so there are no loopholes in this law either. And so all the music happens, the things happen, everybody falls down to worship the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up to himself. Well, not quite all of them. Not quite all. In fact, in verse 8, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. These are our friends, the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." Got to butter them up first, so please live forever. What they're really saying is, I hope you die tomorrow. But since we're talking to him and he's got all the military might, we're going to say, "Oh, live forever. You've made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn and all the other stuff is to fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not worship, just in case you forgot, shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of fire. There are certain Jews whom you've appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They did not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar is in a rage and in anger. He gives orders to bring those 3 men, and they're brought before the king. And he says, "Is it true, you 3, that you don't serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up?" By the way, he doesn't mind if they want to worship their own God. That's okay. They can do that too, but they have to worship him and his. So if you're ready, at the moment you hear the music stuff, go ahead and worship and then we'll be cool. I think that's what the Hebrew says there in verse 15. Basically, that's essentially what he tells them. But if you will not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace with blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? This is where the guy in the kingdom of the left ends up looking like a fool. But he doesn't know that yet. He doesn't know that, right? And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer concerning this. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. This is not a politically correct response. This is why don't you just execute us now kind of language. But notice how it is said purely from a position of faith in God. Because they acknowledge that he has the power to do this. They don't say, oh, no, you can't. They said, if it's to be so, if that's what it is, God will deliver us. And they might be thinking in terms of eternal life or, God ultimately rescuing them in the resurrection. I mean, they don't go into details here. They didn't give a lesson on Jewish theology here, but they said, God will deliver us from this furnace and even from you. And then look at verse 18. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they just stand on their faith and their principle here. They don't argue. They don't accuse. They don't say you're an evil, awful person and you should go to hell. Would they have been in the right to do that? We might think so. We might go, yeah. Evil government, evil dictator. Sure. Wouldn't it be right to say that? Well, they don't. They don't. So again, maybe there's a good example for us here. Just know that we're not going to do what you say, even if it's the law of the land, even if it puts our lives at risk. And so Nebuchadnezzar, as you can imagine, was really happy. Oh, no, wait, filled with wrath, what my translation says. So much that his facial expression was altered. And so he had them stoke the furnace up 7 times hotter than normal, to where it's almost destroying itself and destroying anybody who gets too close to it. So he commanded certain valiant warriors in verse 20 who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace with blazing fire. These men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and they were put into the furnace. This is not looking very good, but you probably know the end of the story. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace had been made extremely hot. The flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The very guards who had to carry them and throw them in the fire died because of the intense heat. But interestingly, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the midst of the furnace, still tied up. They're still tied up. So Nebuchadnezzar probably feeling pretty good about himself, saying, well, I dealt with that. I'm not going to let these dumb Jews, counter my commandments or my commands, my laws, and get away with it. I've got to look good in front of my people. I have to maintain this position of power. But then there's something weird going on here. Was it not 3 men we cast into the midst of the fire? They answered, said to the king, certainly, O king. And he answered and said, this is Nebuchadnezzar, saying, I see 4 men loosed. Loosed means they were unbound. They no longer had their bindings on them. And walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. In the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Remember, they put 3 people in there. And Nebuchadnezzar, I can just imagine looking from a distance, right? Because he's not going to get too close to that inferno. He's like, wait a minute. They threw in 3 lumps that landed on the ground, and now I see 4 men walking around in the midst of a fire. This is great staging, by the way. This should be a movie. Oh, maybe it has been. But today we'd make it a really cool movie with special effects. CGI, and then never mind. But the 4th is like a son of the gods. So that's the way Nebuchadnezzar is interpreting that. He comes near to the door of the furnace blazing with fire in 26, responded and said, now notice, he knows which 3 these are. It's got to be, right? Don't know who the 4th one is, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the most high God. So, notice that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were talking to him back up in 16 and 17, they didn't even seem to use that phraseology. But so something big is happening here where Nebuchadnezzar recognizes this. He still believes in multiple gods. That doesn't change. We find out more about him as the story moves on. He still believes there are, his own gods and so forth. But suddenly he's putting the Jewish God up on a pedestal that he had not done previously. The Most High God, come here. And they walked out of the fire. They came out. Notice they stayed where they were supposed to be until he calls for them. That's just crazy. And so then the officials, the VIPs who are there, are now gathering around. They see that this has happened. They notice that their hair didn't burn. Their trousers are okay. They don't even smell like fire. They don't even smell like they're burned up. And so Nebuchadnezzar responds and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants." Notice here he changed it to angel. He saw that it was an angel, or he perceived it was an angel. "His servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any God except their own God." So he understands what they said and what they meant, and he understands that this is what he has just witnessed. And then look at what happens in 29. "I therefore make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." So he's still not confessing one true God, right? He still believes in his own gods and so forth, but he recognizes that something very powerful is going on here. And so his response is, okay, if you oppose their God, I'm going to kill you. Not just my gods now, but yeah. So it's a very inappropriate response, but you can see him starting to shift. And if you know the end of the story, Nebuchadnezzar ultimately turns to God, but he goes through a ton before we get there. But the focus here is on, look at how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these friends of Daniel, how they comported themselves, how they responded in the face of their lives being threatened, on the basis of them not being willing to basically worship idols. So that's an astounding story, and I think that's somewhat instructive about how we should comport ourselves when we're confronted with ungodly or even evil things. And oh, by the way, verse 30, "Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon." So this happens, this obviously makes an impression, and whether it's out of fear, I think it's probably more out of fear than out of faith at this point. But he also makes sure they get cushy jobs and they do really well. They're given stuff to do. And we know a little bit later on that Daniel and these friends of his were given positions of authority and responsibility, and that they performed really well. So that's an interesting dynamic in this story too, is not only were they faithful to God, but they did serve their masters in the kingdom of the left. They served Babylon. They served Nebuchadnezzar and his successors. Why? Because that's where God had put them. Now, were they hoping, maybe even praying that God would deliver them out of that place? Sure, maybe every day. I mean, we know Daniel's a man of prayer. We're going to read about that here in just a second. And so praying for his people and praying for deliverance from this might have been a regular part of it. But even though that had not happened, they are living as free men, what Peter said, but not letting that freedom lead them to a place where they think it's an excuse to do evil. They continue to do what was right and not do what was evil. They continue to do what I would call those Ephesians 2:10 good works that God has prepared beforehand for them to walk in, serving their masters. Because somehow, even in this Old Testament setting, they came to understand, and I don't know exactly how, that the stuff that Peter and Paul would talk about in the New Testament was also true here. That they were in the situation they were in, and it was a terrible situation, but that God had their souls. They were still in God's hand. Even though they're in these horrible circumstances where you'd almost forgive them for not believing that. And yet they did. And I know that there's no way they did this just of their own power and might. They did this because the Holy Spirit working in them, even if they didn't recognize it. So we're gonna fast forward a little bit to Daniel chapter 6. So at this point, um, there's a different king involved here, Belshazzar. I'll make sure I get this right. This is Belshazzar, right? Yes, this is Belshazzar. Which is confusing because Daniel's real name is Belteshazzar. And so you can, if you're reading Daniel, you have to make sure you keep those straight. Daniel's name is Belteshazzar, but Belshazzar has now become the king. Nebuchadnezzar has this amazing thing happen where he goes off and lives like an animal for a long time, but it actually, he comes around. And it's an amazing story. But then in chapter 5, actually, we learn a bit about Belshazzar. Belshazzar is no better than Nebuchadnezzar had been previously, but through military conquest, he comes into power here. In chapter 6, we end up hearing from Darius. Darius is interesting because we don't know if that's a name or just a title, because we know that that word was used as a title, but it's referred to here like a name. And so Darius overran Belshazzar. Belshazzar was not wildly successful. There's a whole story in chapter 5 that you're probably familiar with, the handwriting on the wall. That wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, that was Belshazzar, who saw this handwriting on the wall at a big feast, and he's like, I don't know what to do with this. And then somebody says, there's this old guy, this old Jewish guy named Daniel. He seems to be good with this sort of stuff. And Daniel comes and interprets the handwriting on the wall and all that. And again, there's, Daniel's just being faithful to what God has given him to do. And Belshazzar actually kind of, rewards him in a way. But then Belshazzar, that message was, you're going to die. And you're going to die really soon. And that night he died. That was a gross oversimplification of what happened there, but read chapter 5. So in chapter 6, now we have Darius. Yes, evil king after evil king evil ruler after evil ruler after evil ruler. Darius the Mede is who we're talking about now, from the Medo-Persian Empire. They're the ones who overran Babylon at this point. It says what his age is. Oh yeah, there it is at the end of chapter 5. He's 62 years old. That's a great age. Guess how old I am? How come I don't have a kingdom? Oh, maybe because I haven't overrun everybody and slaughtered all the innocents. Okay, maybe that might have something to do with it. But Darius, and these guys weren't dumb. The Medo-Persian Empire was successful not because they were such a huge military might. They had grown quite a bit, but they were also smart strategically. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. In other words, leverage the people who are in place to rule over them. Very much we might think of that as the Roman model, but they did all that. And so over them, 3 commissioners, in verse 2, of whom Daniel was one. So he was a very senior guy at this point. Daniel's elderly. And so notice that it says that these satraps might be accountable to them, that the king might not suffer loss. So Darius is being shrewd here. He's not being magnanimous. He's making sure that he's doing what's best for the kingdom the way he sees things, which means evil stuff is going to ensue. Daniel began distinguishing himself amongst the commissioners and the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So in other words, he was a really great leader, right? Other people in leadership positions respected him and undoubtedly reported that up, as we are to do, especially when a new administration comes in. There's a lot of figuring out who's a good servant, who's not a good servant. These days we're going to say who's loyal, who's not loyal. And in that sense, Daniel was loyal, not to false gods, but he was loyal to whoever God had put in authority over him, even really bad people. Okay, and so the thing is, Daniel was an old Jewish guy. So he wasn't the favorite amongst other leaders at that level. In fact, it said the commissioners, this is verse 4, the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. Catch that? In regard to government affairs. Had nothing to do with his faith they were just jealous, I think. I think we just have some of that going on here. You know, he was old, he was a Jew, so he's a foreigner, let's get some purebloods in here, something like that. But no negligence or corruption was found in him. And they even, this is making them, have problems. We shall not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So they figure out he's comported himself, he's behaved in such a way that there's no accusation you can level against him. Even though he was in an evil, corrupt system, he treated people well. He served his masters without violating his conscience or his God. And these guys are smart enough to perceive that they're not going to get away with it in the civil realm. So we're going to have to go after him on the basis of his faith. And they do. We'll fast forward a little bit here. So they get together and they convince Darius to make up a decree. And where is it here? Verse 7, the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. This is sounding like a familiar tactic, like the same one that people used against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego under Nebuchadnezzar. Same sort of thing. We don't have Darius setting up a golden obelisk and all that and demanding to be worshipped. Here we have people underneath him suggesting, oh, let's make sure they're all loyal to you, right? It's just 30 days. It's only 30 days. Anybody can do that, even if they have to fake it, right? They can pretend to worship you for 30 days and then we'll just let them go on with their lives. But they knew that Daniel was not going to do that. They probably knew the story, might have heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and thinking, this is a good trap. Now, if they really paid attention to that story, including the end of it, they might have predicted that they wouldn't be successful. But Darius signs the document in verse 9, and in 10, after it's signed, it says he entered his house. Now this is Daniel, entered his house with his roof chamber open towards the windows in his roof chamber open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. So again, we have somebody violating the law, the civil law, you might say, the criminal law, I guess, in order to keep God's law. So same thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing, but again, not making a big show of it, not bragging about it, not calling attention to himself. Remember, in this case, he's got people who are spying on him, who are watching him, who are waiting for this moment. And so the men find him making petition and application before God. And so these guys go to Darius and they talk, hey, didn't you sign that paper that we told you to sign? That means that nobody can worship another god for 30 days. Didn't you do that? And then they say, this statement is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. So they're trying to use the system, right? This cannot be revoked. In other words, you made this law, you're stuck with it. So Daniel, who happens to be one of the exiles from Judah, doesn't pay any attention to you, O king. Now, is that true? Of course not. But in this one regard, it is. Or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this statement, notice his reaction. He was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. So this is a little different than what we saw with Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar got mad. Darius recognizes the value in Daniel, even though he's only serving him in these kingdom of the left, governmental affairs kinds of matters, the administration of the kingdom, things like that. And maybe he realizes he got trapped. Maybe he realizes he was played here. It doesn't really say that, I don't think. But it bothers him so much that he spends the rest of the day trying to figure out some way to undo what he had done or to give Daniel a loophole to get out of it. But these guys are not going to let him do that. Recognize, O king, in verse 15, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. In other words, you signed it, you're stuck with it. So he has no choice but to have Daniel thrown into the lion's den, because that was part of the injunction, right? And they seal up the lion's den, and Darius is not happy about this. Through this whole thing, he never is pleased about this. In fact, in verse 19, the king arose at the dawn, at the break of day, because Daniel had been in there all night, and he went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den, Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And this is a tremendous verse, because it tells you some things. It tells you how much he valued Daniel, that it troubled him, not only the day before, but all night. It troubled him. But he also, although Daniel served him in the kingdom of the left, look at what this sentence says. Servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Was he holding out hope? Maybe not, I don't know. But what he said probably reflected on how Daniel had influenced him. So Daniel served him in the kingdom of the left. We get the impression here that Daniel did not hide the fact that he was still faithful to God and always would be. There's nothing that suggests that they ever had a conversation where Daniel said, I'll do whatever you need me to do, boss. Just don't ask me to worship another God. There's no suggestion that was ever said, you know? And so when, because otherwise maybe Darius wouldn't have let himself get trapped into this, right? He might have thought, ooh, I wonder if one of, why are these guys doing this? Is it because they're so dedicated to me, or are they trying to entrap somebody else? He might have figured it out, but he didn't. And so Daniel answers in verse 21, O king, live forever. Now, I've mentioned before that people would address Nebuchadnezzar and other evil kings that way, not because they loved them and wanted them to live forever, but because one, that keeps you alive, and two, things are going to go much more smoothly for you if you butter up the laws, right? To put it in
Good
plain terms. Yeah, good politics. There you go. And so Daniel responds here, and I think Daniel, I'm not saying that he thinks he wants Darius to be immortal. That's not it, but he's giving him the standard greeting of respect and honor that you would expect a servant, certainly, to give to a ruler, or an employee to give to an employer. But this was a prisoner with a death sentence giving term of respect in his initial response back to Darius. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. And of course, Daniel gets out, and Darius elevates him even more. And by the way, in some of these cases, the accusers wound up being torn limb from limb and had their houses crushed and their families killed. These guys are still not nice. But focus here is on how the people from God's kingdom of the right behave in the kingdom of the left. And so Joseph, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, these are just three stories. You can find others, but these are great ones that have just profound lessons for us, I think, in how you conduct yourself when you're in the midst of a situation that you probably didn't ask for, to where you perceive godlessness around you constantly, and where your life might even be at risk. And in these stories, we all find these people of God being sustained by him, coming through and influencing the kingdom of the left. So when we start thinking about voting and all those things, we have an opportunity to bring our influence as members of the kingdom of the right to the kingdom of the left. It doesn't mean we beat people over the head with it. Sometimes I really want to, but that's not the biblical example, is never beat them over the head. Insofar as you are able, be at peace with all men. Something that we're encouraged to do in the New Testament, be at peace with all men. And I think this is part of it. And I think that these examples are things that we can think about. It's not going to change my opinion on the politics, but it might change my opinion about how I deal with other people that God has put in my path. And that's something I know I need to work on, because my attitude can get really ugly at times towards people who don't see the world the way I do. Yeah, it's still a terrible temptation. So, and that's probably not true for any of you, but if it is, we can commiserate. All right, we went a little bit long here. Sorry about that, but I wanted to get through those. I thought that was kind of important. Because this is living out who we are as members of the kingdom of the right, even though we live daily in the kingdom of the left. So I wanted to get through those longer examples so we could really think about those. And so with that, there are other things here. I've got other verses. I'm not going to go through them. We'll start a new lesson next week. And some of this, by the way, was in our recent sermon series. So the poll tax to Caesar, we had actually had that. I think John 18 was mentioned in the sermon last week or the week before. But I will leave you with two interesting verses, and these are on page 5 of your handout. Micah 6:8 and Isaiah 1:17. I'm just going to read these because they're probably familiar. They might be, but it's very interesting. Micah 6, he has told you, mortal one, or, oh man, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? And then in Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, obtain justice for the orphan, plead for the widow's case. Those are fascinating to me because those are both statements about how we live in the kingdom of the left. The kingdom of the right too, but this is where the kingdom of the right informs, molds, shapes how we live in the kingdom of the left. And you know, that verse out of Micah is quoted a lot. And if you read that, do justice, love kindness. Those are things that definitely affect the kingdom of the left. And walk humbly with your God is exactly why we seek to do that. And so that's how we walk through those works that God has prepared beforehand. Any comments or questions? I know, very late. Glenn?
The last day to register to vote is October 7th.
Okay, thank you for that reminder. Yeah, if you're not registered, please do. And inform yourself, have an informed opinion and all that. Lord, we thank you for our time together today. Be with us going forth from this place. Help us to make good decisions in both kingdoms. Help us to seek to grow what we do in the kingdom of the right here at Gloria Dei through the capital campaign and through whatever other mechanisms you have in place, and help us to be salt and light in the kingdom of the left so that people can see you reflected in our behavior and in our words. We ask these and all things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.